Yeah, my name is Mallion-Moore, short for Christine. And let's see, my age, that's something I'm quite proud to say. Actually, I'm almost 69, so 68. And I live in Burlington now, in the LaSalle Towers, just by the LaSalle Park. But my career as a public librarian reached its height kind of at Burlington Public Library. So I was at Central Library on New Street, and I was the local history librarian for 15 years. We had a boat, a Beneteau 38-foot sailboat, and we had it down in the British Virgin Islands, which is south of Puerto Rico. And we sailed for about 9 years, back and forth. We would fly down and sail down there. So we had about 8 years down in Puerto Rico in our wonderful boat, which we don't have anymore. So my family's been living in Canada since the American Revolution. So that's 1776. So I'm very attuned to New York State, upstate New York. I go there as much as I can. And then my family, who came from Germany, and I'll get into the origin of that later, but they were in New York State. So upstate New York is where they ended up, if you're familiar with that. And that's, of course, where the Six Nations tribes were. So, and Joseph Brant was a Mohawk. And so they were in upstate, what we call today upstate New York, so south of, just trying to think how you would look at it. If you go from Kingston, Ontario, and go south, you've heard of Syracuse, New York, maybe, or the Great Lake area. You've heard of the Hudson River area, so they settled between the Hudson River, that's the river that goes right down to Manhattan, and then they were on the Mohawk River. And the, I'm trying to think of the name of the other river, Susquehanna River, but the Mohawk indigenous people, the Mohawk River. And that's where my people settled before the American Revolution. And that's what brought them to this part of the world, to Ontario. They were United Empire Loyalists. My family came from the Rhine River area, and they were vine dressers. So when we think of the Niagara wineries, people that look after vines, this is what a lot of the people that came from that area did. They farmed, but they were looking after vines. They, in the 1600s and early 1700s, were Protestants. And to make a long story short about European history, you've heard of the very famous Louis XIV of France, okay, and you've heard of Versailles. Louis XIV of France was Catholic, of course, and there were always wars in Europe, if you do your history of, he was trying to push back Protestantism and the Catholic wars. So my family were like many families today that leave because of persecution, religious persecution. And they were fortunate enough to live on the Rhine, and they were fortunate enough to find out that Queen Anne of England was Protestant, and she had heard of the terrible way they were being treated, the Palatine people. Palatine, it's called that because it's that district of Germany, Palatine. Okay? So that word. So they were referred to as Palatines. And Queen Anne, quite a famous individual, she felt sorry for them. And I have copies of documents here where she had posters all through London, England, and she called them my poor Palatines. Oh, yeah. And they were these Palatines, in the hundreds and hundreds of them, several thousand of them, were in tent cities. And what am I reading about today? You pick up the newspaper today and we're reading about people living in tents today, or refugees in tent cities, right? This is a common story of immigration today. So, it's not changed. I mean, in 400 years, So they were there for quite a while. There's information in parliamentary papers, if you research it, which I've done a little of, where they were tolerated for a while, and then they weren't tolerated, just the way we want people to not be in tent cities. And the government of Britain came up with this, what they thought was a brilliant idea, to have these Palatine people come across the ocean in 10 ships. So they left from Portsmouth, England, which is the south coast of England, in 10 ships. And we know how, you think of Mayflower going to Plymouth, Massachusetts, they were small ships, right? So there were 10 ships. It took them 20 weeks to come over. It's a long time in the North Atlantic. And they were to come to what is today, it's very easy today because it's Manhattan today, ships. They needed, those straight, the wood from pine trees, the straight trees to build their ships. And they needed something, because the ships were all wooden, they needed something called pitch from, the sap from pine trees? So that's pitch or pine tar. And there's a certain type of pine tar that was used to make the British ships, the Navy. And there were hundreds of ships in the British Navy. They were famous. So they thought, the British government thought, let's send these German people, these Palatines, over to this part of the world, New York State, and look, it's wilderness. We've got all these pine trees. Let's get this pine pitch. Let's get these people, we'll give them the trip over. You've lived in London in tents. Work off what you owe us from bringing you over to the New World. Work a number of years, make this pine pitch, and then we'll give you land. And this is the immigration story for a lot of people. And what happened, and this was fascinating in my research, was it didn't work. The type of pine tree that was in New York State didn't have the correct type of sap. So the whole thing was a complete failure. So again, think of immigration stories. People are now in the New World where there was really nothing. So Governor Hunter, his name is, and I've seen my ancestors' names on the Governor Hunter's ration lists, things so they didn't die that winter, food, axes, shoes, whatever, clothing, that kind of thing. They ended up then saying, okay, that's not going to work in the Manhattan area. That's a failure. And my ancestors, I just think back how they must have, they're in a country that they speak German, they're having to learn other languages. So then the British government weren't going to bring them back to England, and said, okay, we have the French Indian Wars going on in North America. So this is before the American Revolution, right? This is before 1776. So the French were in Quebec, and they were referred to as the French Indian Wars. So let's have a nice boundary, or a buffer is a better word, of these ancestors who are, great farmers, and they're here. Let's put them in this part of what is now New York State as a buffer between the coast, the English, and the French, who are up in Quebec, in that area, and wanting to take over. And then you've got all of the indigenous people. Joseph Brant, the Six Nations, he was Mohawk. So that's where they ended up. They ended up moving them from Manhattan. I don't know if you know New York City very well, but there's the Hudson River. It's a very famous river. They moved these people, the Palatines, up the river, and I've done my genealogy. I've gone to where they lived in upstate New York. So they moved them there for a while, and there was a west camp and an east camp on the Hudson River where they tried to survive. And then finally that wasn't successful, and so they moved even further north and west to the Mohawk River. And they survived they were given land, but can you imagine what that land was? It was wilderness. There was nothing, right? So they were given that land, and my ancestors, so Theobald Young and his children, so Theobald was the one that came over from Germany, and the ancestor I trace through is Adam, one of his sons, who was born in New York State. They ended up with something like 2,500 acres of land. They ended up with what was called an Indian trading post. That's how it was referred to. They ended up with a mill, a sawmill, a potash. It's called potash, Potash, and he pronounces it Bodash because he had a German accent. They ended up very, very successful over decades and decades. And they survived because the indigenous people helped them learn how to live in that land. So they were there for decades and decades. And then comes, history. Here we go again with immigration, the American Revolution, the War of Independence. And you've heard of United Empire Loyalists. So my people are perfect examples of very early loyalists. Like I'm a loyalist, I'm loyalist background, who came over because they sided with the British during the American Revolution. So that began in 1776, as you know. And it's no surprise, knowing how the Palatines from Germany were in England with Queen Anne, and it was the British that brought them over. So no surprise that these people would not side with the Patriots, they would side with the British Crown. My ancestors signed up with the Butler's Rangers, and I've got documents here that show them, listed, and one was a captain and one was a lieutenant, that kind of thing. And Butler's Rangers were, they did a lot of guerrilla warfare in that part of, I'm going to focus on New York State. And Joseph Brant, and his Brant's Volunteers, who were comprised of both Native people and loyalists, both. This is one of the way they acted too. So the Brant's group and Butler's Rangers were often at the same skirmishes, small battles, guerrilla warfare, go in, burn down a patriot's farm, village, town, that kind of thing. That's sort of how it worked. And what happened with Theobald and Adam was they got in a lot of trouble because they were referred to as spies in their own territory for the crown. And Adam was in jail for 11 months. His wife and children were in jail. The Patriots put them in jail for helping, so either giving information or supplying the British, soldiers. So they were basically behind the scenes spies and suppliers, and they were punished for that. And when Adam and his father Theobald got out of prison, even the wife and the children were in prison, they lost everything. Burned, taken, livestock taken. I've got lists of what they owned, right down to horses and cows and that kind of thing. They lost everything. So at that point, having lost everything, and then signing up with Butler's Rangers, and fighting alongside Joseph Brant, they were able to cross over at what is called Niagara-on-the-Lake today. It was called Newark then, in those days, and they were given land. I've got documents that show Theobald, who was an older man by then, who farmed right by the Niagara River. If you go to Niagara-on-the-Lake today, then you see Fort George, and then across the river you see Fort Niagara. He had land there and was given land to supply, this is still the American Revolution, is still going on, to supply the British. Yeah, well, they were always like immigrants today. This is a really good time to talk about this because of what the world's going through today. We read the news and we hear about, people coming across the Mediterranean on boats and landing and living in tent cities. So this to me is, I did study history in university, and to me history is, I relate to it so much too. You have to know, to understand today, you have to know what happened yesterday. And when I read about my ancestors, it's just like what I'm reading about in the paper today, where they weren't wanted. They left for reasons of persecution. What they went through to live was extremely difficult. but they kept going. Yes, very, very difficult. Many of them didn't survive. I can't believe how tough these ancestors that survived would have had to have been. Physically tough, mentally tough, learning new languages, learning an empty world. Imagine going to an empty place, a wilderness. So I have great admiration for my ancestry. I'm really, really proud of it. Well, my whole half of the family wouldn't be in this part of the world if they hadn't come. Canada is a country of immigration, as is the United States. So I've got I feel a sense of American loyalty too. When I read about how Joseph Brant and the Mohawk people worked directly with my ancestors and welcomed them and helped them, there's nothing that makes me feel more connected to our country and to what our country has been going through in the last number of years vis-a-vis recognition of Native claims and Native rights and past abuses. So, the history of this family to me is very relevant to today. So I'll just show you, if you Google plaque to the Young family on the Grand River, anyone Googles that, it will take them to this beautiful marker on the Grand River. So you can see the marker with a bronze plaque on it. And I'll just read this to you because it's there today because my family put it there. There's even a little parking lot there, so you can park. So it says on this bronze plaque, this land beside the Grand River was part of the Young Tract. It was granted to Adam Young and his family for their loyalty to the Crown during the American Revolution. This was in recompense for the loss of valuable land and possessions in the Mohawk Valley, New York State, confiscated during the conflict. Adam, his wife Catherine, and children were imprisoned both for their resistance to the Continental Congress and Adam's brave actions in assisting 74 loyalists escape to what is now Canada. Adam and his sons John, Daniel's my direct ancestor, and Henry fought in the Butler's Rangers alongside the Mohawks led by Joseph Brant. When Adam was discharged from the Butler's Rangers, he pioneered on one of the first farms at Niagara, later joining his sons and their families along the Grand River. The loyalty of the Young family to their new country was confirmed during the War of 1812, when Adam's sons, John and Daniel, fought to preserve their homeland. This is yet again. When Adam died in 1790 and his son John in 1812, they were buried in a cemetery on this land between here, so between the plaque, and the river. The Youngs are remembered as one of the families who, having suffered for their beliefs, helped to build the new and growing country of Canada. So, you don't get more early Canadian than that in this part of the world. So I'm so proud of that, and I cannot take any credit. I wish I could for being involved in that, but this family of mine that did all this research, and they have information and the decades it took them to get the Canadian government to allow them to build this this remembrance, which was on a cemetery where a lot of the Youngs were buried, including my ancestors. Well, your typical background, I've got an English background on my father's side, and then I'm Canadian and go way back. So, just your ordinary Thanksgiving, Canada Day. Canada Day means more to me now, okay, because of my research. You're Canadian. You just think, I'm Canadian, I'm from Canada, big deal. Well, when you start doing your research, or if you're a new immigrant, like my son-in-law is, he's Scottish, he married, my daughter went to school in Scotland and met him. And he followed her back to Canada, thank goodness for us. And I went to his citizenship ceremony because he has dual citizenship now. So yes, even someone from the United Kingdom has to go through citizenship. He's not Canadian, but now he's dual United Kingdom. But Scottish people never think of themselves like that. They're Scottish. So Scottish and Canadian. But I went to his wonderful citizenship ceremony, and for me as a long-term Canadian, I'd never been to one, and was it touching for not only him but for all the other people that day that became citizens. I saw people from all over the world becoming new Canadian citizens. Yes, and now that I live back in Burlington, I worked in Burlington for years, and lived in Hamilton, and I consider this whole area, you know, the head of the lake, the Burlington Bay, Hamilton Harbor. They're so connected to each other. But yes, since we're here in Burlington, and I've told you that I was local history librarian at the library, Burlington Public Library, fantastic. Okay, the resources there, unbelievable. So, you know, I have great, I use it all the time. So it's a wonderful community thing. The Burlington Historical Society I am involved with, and I've given some presentations I gave a presentation about Elizabeth Simcoe was a person who I wrote a presentation for, and she had dinner in Newark, Niagara, with Joseph Brant. She met him, and Molly Brant, she knew him. So that was Governor Simcoe and Elizabeth Simcoe. So the Burlington Historical Society is amazing. Third Age Learning was a group that I have been involved with. I'm not now. I was a volunteer. That's a group that for anyone 55 years and up, so the third age of one's life, who wants to keep learning. That's another community group. Burlington has got so many things. The Museums of Burlington, Joseph Brant Museum, Ireland House. Ireland House is so special because in Ireland House are the things that belong to the Ireland family. That's rare. You know, it's not a reproduction. It's not, so many museums you go into, that's not the chair that so-and-so sat on, but it's like the one. Ireland House, those are the things that the Ireland family used. So, yay, Museums of Burlington. This is beautiful what has become of this Joseph Brant Museum. The renovation is amazing. And, look at the replica of Joseph Brant's house, right on the water. He was given all this land for, guess what? Being a loyalist, like my ancestors. I would describe Burlington community, okay, now that I'm a senior, I think Burlington for seniors is great. And I say that because I just found out recently that as a senior with my Presto card, I can travel on the bus system for free within Burlington. And there is a bus that travels from Burlington back to Hamilton. I think Burlington, I think it's a changing community. I hope that I live right next door to LaSalle Park. Now, LaSalle Park is where the explorer LaSalle landed. Again, way back, 1600s. And there's that big, if you've been to LaSalle Park, you've seen that huge stone that's there. That stone's been there since 1926, okay? Well, I live right next door to it, so I walk there as much as I can. There's history right there, old history in this part of the world. But I hope that, I am a little concerned that the downtown, this is the old part that was called Wellington Square before it became called Burlington. So that's Brant Street, and you know yourself that where I live in Aldershot, it used to be more part of Hamilton. It wasn't even part of Burlington. If you look at this atlas, which I brought. I have my old copy of it, and I'm sure you have it here, this Historical Atlas of Halton County. And I want to get the date right. I'm terrible with numbers. 1877. So in this talks all about this area. So Halton County and Nelson Township, which is the township that Burlington is in, and Lowville, that kind of area. It doesn't even include Aldershot. So the area that I'm in was really part of the Hamilton area. It's in the Wentworth version of these atlases. The library has all of them. I happen to be lucky enough to own this copy. So, I just, think that it's got this town, and now city, has a really interesting history, and I really want to make sure that downtown area, Wellington Square, I'm concerned that, and you can edit this out if you don't like it later, but my opinion is we need to protect our historical part of town, and my concern is with the huge development of high-rises, that we're losing some of that feel. I gave a talk to the Historical Society, I think it was, about Spencer Smith Park, okay? And Spencer Smith Park is named after a man. Spencer Smith was an amazing person. That park would not have been here had it not been for him. But I see, even the years when I started my job at the library, where I'd walk in Spencer Smith Park and over to here, there weren't that many high-rises, there were a few. My concern is this great historic section is going to be overtaken. So I just hope that, and I know the Historical Society, anyone interested in history, hopes for that. So thank goodness this museum is right here. Thank goodness, because this would be developed. This is incredible. It looks right at the lake. So thank goodness. Okay. Well, things are in place now compared to my family story where there wasn't much here. But I think, like my ancestors, be resilient, which is not easy to do. And I mean, for me to say it, I didn't have to learn a new language. I grew up here. So, I feel a little bit hypocritical saying this because it's easy for me to say I already speak English. But I would say, if I try to put myself in a position of I would say I was moving to Thailand or something. Probably one of the biggest things would be honor your own heritage, but you're moving to a new country. The new country is welcoming you, and honor it as well, and learn the language. Honor some of the new customs that aren't your customs. And it doesn't mean you have to give up your customs. It just means that, you can also honor your new country's customs, and also realize, now that I'm grown up and older and have children and grandchildren, realize that if you move to your new country and you have children, your children won't be like you. Your children that will be their country. They will learn that language. They'll still honor the grandparents and culture, but you know that you're the conduit between where you've left and where you're going. And I think that you have to have a lot of resilience to do that. Probably like around the world, because I read the news a lot, like we all do. There's, in the world, you're reading about a lot of anti-immigration feelings today because of the economy, because of lack of jobs, because housing is so expensive. So I think when you come to a country, and if I know with my son-in-law, he had to show that when he came to this country, and this is from Scotland, this is the crown, we're still part of the Commonwealth of Canada. He had to show that, he was working, he was making an income, he wasn't costing the government, money. So he had to come with all that. you could encounter anti-immigration feelings if you don't come and bring something to the country. And that could just be your own hard work. It will be your own hard work, like my ancestors did. It will be taking a job that maybe you trained as an engineer, but you can't be an engineer yet. You're driving a taxi. You weren't doing that in your, it's tough moving countries. I see that.
Are you that up to date?
Very much so. And even in my own family today, only because of my son-in-law and what he's gone through. And, I'm so grateful that he's made that, it's been a lot for him. He's a proud Scot. He's not Canadian, and he's learned to become both. And his children are Canadian. And, for him to instill their pride of his country. If you know Scots, they're very proud of Scotland, and they have a lot of reasons to be that way. So, my little grandsons, they do go back to Scotland every 2 years, and they do, have Scottish football teams, so soccer we call it, that they're into, and, that they're Canadian, so there's lots of ways. You can do it through food. There's many ways that when an immigrant comes to a new country, they can blend.
We'll see.
No, I think you're interviewing people with their immigration stories is wonderful. Mm-hmm. And as I say, especially today, I have a grandson who's Canadian, but he looks and is half Chinese. So my son married his wife, who's from Nanjing, China, and so born in Nanjing, not like she's from there, and my son met her at university. My son's Canadian way back, and my little grandson, Parker, who's 8, looks completely Asian, Chinese, and he's Canadian. And he'll, I look at him and I see him with us, and I see people looking at my husband and I with him, and if we're not with my son or daughter-in-law, and they're looking at, there's a couple of white grandparents with us, and he's my Canadian grandson. Mm-hmm. He's all of it, and he goes back with his Chinese grandparents and now speaks Mandarin fluently. There are great in Canada. Some immigration stories have great support. I know Chinese are the Chinese community is very supportive. I only know that because of my grandson. Italian, like Hamilton had a lot of Italian immigrants. In fact, a lot of them came from that area in Calabria, actually. But doing this history for me, especially for someone like me who hasn't had to go to another country, I travel. But, especially for someone like me, and I don't know if you've met a lot of people like me sitting in this chair we've been here a long time. But doing my family history has really taught me a lot. It really has. And it's made me really humble, because I don't know if I could have done what they did. Mm-hmm. It was incredible. And they lost everything again and again. Like I think of Theobald and Adam. Let's lose it all again. Start